Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. My name is Hermes, and I'm joined here by my colleague Am, and we will be your technical facilitators today. You are at the session titled Key Messages from Day 3, which will be followed immediately by our side event titled Partnerships to Harmonize Science Information and Knowledge at Regional Scales for Enabling Adaptation, alongside a parallel event for Origami Night. Japanese language simultaneous interpretation is available during this session. The feature has already been activated and is available now. To listen in Japanese, please click the interpretation button in the menu at the bottom of your screen and select Japanese. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we'd like to let you know that this meeting will be recorded for documentation purposes. The chat box is also available in case you have any perspectives that you'd like to share, or if you need to reach out to me or Am for technical assistance. For those of you just joining us, welcome. You are at the session titled Key Messages from Day 3. I think that we are ready to get started, so I will now pass the floor to Mozaharul Alam, head of the APAN Secretariat and Regional Climate Change Coordinator at the United Nations Environment Program, Asia and the Pacific Office. Mozaharul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hermes. Dear participants, welcome to the Day 3 Key Message session. Focus of the day is science and assessment. And in this session, we will provide a quick summary of each session that you have attended, or maybe you have missed as you were attending other sessions. So this will provide you an opportunity to listen. The key messages came out from the parallel session. Specifically, we'll present the key messages and action necessary to advance the resilience building effort in Asia Pacific region. You will be hearing from me as well as from the other colleagues and the partners who actually led delivering the 4th technical session. And I will introduce them once I provide the summary on the plenary session on science and assessment. So let me begin by presenting the key messages and suggestions came out from the plenary session on the science and assessment. So the first one is what they talked about: the best available science can help decision makers. It's also important to understand what role science and the risk assessment do play in policy and the decision-making process, and where waiting for more precise and the accurate data might also be used as a way to defer the decision on adaptation. So the key message is that we can use the science, and if we need to use the precise knowledge, we can wait for it. The second one, they talked about the innovation and the solution for climate change adaptation came from bottom up, from those at the front line as well as from lab. So it's in a combination of the two. It is important to include the indigenous and the local traditional knowledge along with the technologies as it may not suit with the local circumstances. So this is also the issue of blending. The third message, which lead to where we need to bring changes, need for a systematic change, and maybe we have heard this, the changes at the systemic level also, second day and the first day of the forum. They have also talked about the downfalls, which are lack of coherence, low capacity, insufficient investment in learning, the siloed approach in science as well. So then is suggesting need for a coordinated effort from many different actors, ensure that the research is coordinated and empower the actors. So with all those, the key messages, the 3 changes that the plenary session suggested, and maybe you will find some of those changes suggested are common in the technical sessions that you will be reporting, you meaning my colleagues who will be reporting and you will be hearing. The changes suggested in the plenary session is a user-centric approach to science and assessment. And the scientific information need to be presented in a way that is usable and understandable also by vulnerable communities. Also, they talked about the need to demystify the science and translate it into a language that can be useful for all. And that is where the communication needs to play an important role, and the targeted role when communicating the science and the information. So that is the first area where the change need to happen. The second area to blend this, the scientific knowledge and the community knowledge and the know-how is the action research. And that engage the communities as a key in the science and should encompass all the social and the behavioral science as well. So it is not only the community knowledge, but also that the social science aspect need to be incorporated or blended here. There is a need to strengthen the links among the action-oriented and the applied research with what is happening on the ground, and strengthening the science communities, especially the human science. So that is the area also the emphasis need to be put. The third, the suggestion is the partnership approach, which is important to provide support to development of the science, bringing everyone on board, mainstreaming adaptation that provides a collective opportunity to work across the discipline, strengthening the regional and the transboundary cooperation, which is also important. And climate change does not recognize the political boundaries. That is also came strongly, and we need the regional cooperation, and then the landscape could be one of the approach also when we're talking about the partnership approach there. So with that, I'd like to now request and my pleasure to invite Dhrupad. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I'm making mistakes. It's my pleasure to invite Fatema to provide and share the key messages that came out from the nature resilience, the technical discussion. Fatema, over to you.
Many thanks, Babu. And in fact, some of the key messages that have come out of the plenary session definitely speak to and resonate with some of the key messages that I'll be sharing with you all today from our session this morning, which is a really rich and interactive discussion amongst experts that we brought together and the audience. So with examples from the HinduKush Himalayan region, and the Pacific small island developing states, including Nepal to Samoa, Vanuatu, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. This session generated insights from across the region on how adaptation knowledge gaps are being closed to scale up nature-based action specific to the Asia-Pacific region, and the role of effective partnerships in this regard. So some of the key points raised include the critical importance of context-specific knowledge for target users. And this also includes for the context of national priorities to inform the national adaptation plans. In addition, the need for useful methods and approaches to close persisting knowledge gaps. This includes aligning supply of and demand for adaptation knowledge. We need meaningful win-win partnerships to inform our success, and partnerships need to include engagement with communities, long-term relationships, and also require solidarity and empathy that is entwined with empowering local communities. The critical importance of also strong intersectoral partnerships across, in other words, cross-sectoral, across ministries, across departments, also are necessary to further scale up adaptation action. Like you mentioned, as part of your keynote sort of remarks or feedback, was that traditional knowledge for us also was considered to be a pertinent issue. It is key to adaptation action, and actions need to also promote gender equality in climate change responses that will lead to synergies with other SDGs. Assessing adaptation finance was also noted as necessary to further invest in national adaptation planning and already the ongoing initiatives that need financing to scale up activities. Whilst we recognize that NBS and ecosystem restorations are essential and critical and provide useful adaptation solutions, they also require mobilization of finance. And also the need for larger society to be part of these conversations when we talk about nature-based approaches. We had a number of different actions that were noted as part of our discussions, and I'll just mention one that might be of interest to the audience. We are looking for collaborative adaptation actions through meaningful partnerships, as mentioned, and that we see as an excellent pathway to close knowledge barriers that were discussed in the session. One way that we're going to be going about this is through the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative, which is a UNFCCC Secretariat initiative in partnership with UNEP through the Global Adaptation Network. And we'll be partnering with ICIMOD and other partners in the HinduKush Himalayas, as well as SPREP in the Pacific sub-region to further close priority knowledge gaps over 2021. So please stay tuned in terms of the activities that will be forthcoming in the many months to come. I will leave it at that, Babu. Thank you.
Presenting the summary and the key messages. Thank you, Fatema, for presenting the key messages that came out from the nature-based resilience, the discussion. Now it's my pleasure and to invite Dhrupad to present the summary from the inclusive resilience session. Over to you, Dhrupad.
Thank you, Babu. We had a very interesting session, and the session presented the latest scientific understanding on transboundary risks, a dimension of climate risk which is often overlooked. So this was very interesting in terms of seeing what are the impacts and what are the implications in terms of transboundary risks arising, very specifically focusing on the HinduKush Himalayas. The session was chaired by Dr. Prabhakaran of IGES, and in his opening remarks, Dr. Prabhakaran outlined the kinds of climate impacts that spill across borders and have implications not only in terms of the communities and the populations within the HinduKush Himalayan region, but also across borders and much beyond the HinduKush Himalayas. In her keynote, Professor A.B. of the University of Washington provided the latest climate science and observed physical impacts. And a very important point that she made was that climate change is causing significant impacts. That is known, and it's quite confidently we can say that. But what is more important is that these impacts will probably increase as we go along in the future. This was then followed by an illustration and presentation from Dr. Arun Shrestha from ICIMOD, who talked on what are the transboundary risks arising from cryosphere, the melting of glaciers. And he made another very important point. Looking at the trends of cryosphere melting, he said that unless we stay at 1.5 degrees, climate change will transform very soon into climate crisis for the Himalayas, and having implications downstream as well. This is a very important observation that he made. Following Dr. Shrestha, we had a very interesting presentation from Freda Lager from SCI, who talked on the transboundary related implications of risk and how that affects food chains and trade. Taking the example of rice, he showed that what happens in Asia can affect not just the countries which we are talking about in this region, but it can actually affect even countries as far as Senegal, increasing food prices and therefore increasing the risk and vulnerability of the marginal and the disadvantaged. Following these presentations, we had a input from Babu, who was also part of the panel, and he talked on the national adaptation plans as they're being formed and the NDCs and how their opportunities actually will exist, which can then, if we take care, start paying attention to the transboundary risk and taking measures which then help countries to actually take measures to reduce vulnerabilities and to reduce risks. I think two important things that he also pointed out was the link of transboundary risk and inclusive resilience. And two very important points that he made was what is the link in terms of geography, and two in terms of the thematic areas and the stakeholders who are involved in terms of in the process of developing national adaptation plans. And he suggested that we need to go beyond boundaries, beyond these accepted boundaries, if we want to ensure that the climate risks are being addressed. Moving on, we had a very good audience interaction, and in that we had about very interactive interactions with them, which brought about two important points. One, that out of the audience, which was 40 plus, 65% of the audience and participants had actually either experienced transboundary risk in the work or in the area where they were coming from. And two, they helped to prioritize this transboundary risk, identifying water security and disaster as the main transboundary risk, but also acknowledging that migration, energy, and trade were important risks which are there. Finally, in regard to what mechanisms or which bodies can address transboundary risk, the suggestion from the audience was regional bodies as well as UNFCCC are bodies which can help in nations in addressing the climate transboundary risks. We had finally the key messages also shared with the audience and voted on. And I just read out the first three which were at the highest vote. The first was that the present scientific knowledge is inadequate to understand transboundary risks, and therefore there's a need to improve or deepen our understanding at regional level. The second, transboundary risks are real and can compromise both national adaptation plans as well as nationally determined commitments. And therefore, there's a strong need for strengthening regional cooperation to address these and to deliver climate action at scale with speed. The third key message was recognizing the HinduKush Himalayan region as a climate hotspot, and also recognizing that climate impacts on the HKH can have serious transboundary impacts downstream, which affect food security, energy, and water security. And lastly, a mechanism is needed under the UNFCCC framework that can inform parties and negotiations for effective and immediate action to address the climate risk arising from transboundary risk. Now, linked to that, we must realize that while national adaptation plans and national determined commitments are country-specific, there's a gap in terms of addressing regional impacts, and we have to find a mechanism to ensure that while NAPs are being done, there are also steps taken to ensure that regional adaptation plans or a mechanism is brought in which address this with adequate financial support. Babu, in his while he was putting forth his views, offered a very interesting, simple, and I think a very quick solution to that by saying that even when we look at the preparation of the national adaptation plans, if we ensure broadening out of the stakeholders who are involved, whether it is the different ministries who are not involved at this moment, or the different communities and other stakeholders, if we bring them in, there's probably already a way in the existing mechanism to ensure that some of these transboundary risks are being addressed. Secondly, we need to ensure that there are guidelines in the NAP preparation process where checks and balances are put in, which then ensure that transboundary risks are acknowledged and steps taken to include them into the planning process. I will stop at that. Thank you, Babu.
Thank you, Dhrupad, for making very detailed the presentation and the key messages. I'd like to now invite my colleague from UNDP, Rohini, who will be presenting the summary focusing on community and local resilience. Rohini, over to you.
Thank you very much, Babu. And I think it's very interesting to see that there's a lot of resonance with some of the key messages and summaries which have come out from the other enabler groups. But for the session that we held today, it was convened by ECAD in collaboration with the LDC Universities Consortium. And it was specifically on the topic of the fusion of local and scientific knowledge with a focus on universities. Some of the, I think, key questions were, in fact, the main questions were about how traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge can be fused, and how some of those questions can be answered through action research. What are the opportunities to expand the collaboration among scientists, researchers, and practitioners and local communities, and how to build long-term capacity. I think we had a very, actually a fantastic panel. Dr. Salim was a moderator, and we had the Royal University of Bhutan. We had a representative from the Environmental Climate Change Research Institute in the Philippines. We had a representative from the LSE, also a professor, from the EPIC program, and also a colleague from SPREP, and a really fantastic group of very interactive, I think, sort of inputs coming in as the discussion was taking place. So some of the key messages on this topic. So I think that the first thing is that I guess looking at the cross-cutting between the local resilience, community resilience workstream and the enabler, I think the one thing is this business of this, the separation of knowledge. Is it a continuum, or is it a continuum of knowledge, or is it, popularly we talk a lot about the gaps in knowledge. And I think in terms, one of the key messages was that this traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge is seen as a different domain. And indeed, they are different domains, and both do have merits and limitations, but there's a lot of overlap between these two domains. And there's a very important aspect of communicating across these domains. And at the community level, traditional knowledge provides a very important, sort of information, knowledge, it's traditional knowledge. It could even be about early warning, response information. And also one of the things discussed here is the importance of codifying this knowledge in a systematic way. We had a very good example from SPREP where, it's not looking at knowledge as either or, but looking at a systematic approach of collecting traditional knowledge and stories across countries. So, one of the discussion was about how do you scientifically evaluate stories? And I think here again, bringing some of the insights of local communities in that systematic, rigorous way, working across not just institutions which are currently spreading information, such as the Met services, the forecasting services, but also looking at these, forms of knowledge of local communities, putting them in a kind of a, in a form that is accessible and, can be often cross-checked against, sort of hard knowledge or hard science. I think this was whole sort of discussion. And the second part of this was that if it is not really just about the gaps and there is an overlap, then it's also important for the co-production aspect of this knowledge. I mean, that our panel was really, it covered northern and southern institutions. Often researchers from one part of the world are going to a completely different part of the world, and they might be collecting a sort of data and research from places very different from their own. But it's important to have to emphasize the co-creation of knowledge, that the universities, researchers have to work with the practitioners in the field. And I mean that the knowledge does not necessarily exist in one particular institution, but it is a kind of a collaborative way of working. And the communication, I think, was already mentioned by some of our other, I think, stream leaders. The communication across languages, and I mean, it's not languages purely in a geographic sense. It's that the academic knowledge tends to, I think, terminology is very different from the language that local people understand. So there has to be some training across these domains in terms of communication. And we had a very good example of one of our panelists who talked about climate diplomacy and the importance of communicating scientific knowledge to I mean, even a scientist has to be a diplomat to try and communicate this kind of information in an accessible way to local communities, to policymakers, just across different domains. And the importance of sort of bridging these domains was very important. I think the second key message is that I think knowledge is normally seen as very dispassionate, detached kind of an exercise. It has to be, at a distance. But the issue around this, the kind of knowledge that is required for community adaptation, for local resilience, there is a lot of, there were various words used, building of trust with communities, building the relationship. A lot of our panelists said the importance of heart in this work, solidarity, and the issue of the benefits to communities. It's important to understand at the end, and everyone agreed on that it's really not just that we are not just scientists or researchers or communities, we are all people. And it's very important to have the solidarity in this whole production I mean, let's say in this co-production of knowledge, and also in how we are teaching our students, also to go across when they are going to sort of conduct their research, and to make sure that these divides between academia, policy, communities, are sort of bridged in terms of engaging with each other as human beings, making sure there is a solidarity, because often communities do not get the benefits of the knowledge that often researchers will go and sort of pick up the knowledge, but then there's really no long-term benefit to the community. So and in the current system, there are not that many incentives for researchers to engage with the policymakers or with the communities, because universities, researchers have their own incentive systems, policymakers have their own incentive systems. So it's important there's a tremendous potential out there to use participatory approaches and community level capacity building. And we had a couple of really good examples, which is, I think, from Bhutan, and also from the EPIC network on how they're sort of bridging this across different communities. I think I'm sort of running out of time here. So just a last point, I think, in terms of the messages. On the actions, there's obviously a broad series of actions, but I think everybody agreed it's important to have much more longer term timeframes for researchers to engage meaningfully beyond project cycles. It's not work that is done in one semester. It's also important to get universities much more involved because there seem to be a lot of consultancies involved in this field, and it's very important that national universities are involved in this work, and sort of teaching the students the value of research and the work that can contribute to broader goals. And lastly, making sure that in this field, the geographic scale is very important. It's actually across boundaries, across the world. So, to really look at it, of course, in a scientific, dispassionate way, but also in a way that builds solidarity across. So I think those are some of the key messages. But it was such a rich discussion that it's very hard to, I think there were many more, but hopefully we'll be able to see them in the summary. So back to you.
Okay, thank you, Rohini. And we'll be preparing the detailed summary, and we'll be presenting the summary end of the forum. So please send us the detailed inputs and we'll be capturing those. But thank you very much. Now it's time for me to invite Arghya to share the key messages of the economic sector resilience. And dear participants, sorry, we're taking maybe extra 5 minutes of your time, but over to you, Arghya, to present the summary.
Thank you, Babu. I will keep very short because I don't want to stand between the session and the exciting origami session. So the economic sector, the science was led by Ministry of Environment of Japan in partnership with IGES. A very exciting session with participants from national governments, insurance companies, scientific community, and international organizations. The session was framed around the importance of coherence between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, and how science can be useful to bring these two sectors together. 3 key points or takeaways for me. One was the importance of developing and disseminating tools which provides context-specific information on vulnerability and impacts. And I'm very happy, this is very similar to what Fatema said also in the NBS session about context specificity is critical. We did discuss about the Asia-Pacific Adaptation Information Platform, which government of Japan has been championing, the AP-PLAT, and how it can provide information in that regard. Second point, need of acknowledging and appreciating that these approaches need to evolve. As our understanding evolves, approaches also need to evolve because risk is not very static, which automatically means we need to have new approaches, new adaptive management principles, which require substantive capacity building among developing countries specifically. Third, but not the least, is the importance of investing in collaboration, partnerships, international corporations on this topic of science and assessment to bring the communities together. And such collaboration should also include not only the scientific community, but wider user community on how they can be brought together in ensuring the results are being actually applied for decision-making purposes. Once again, the important role of AP-PLAT was emphasized in helping communities build the capacity and take the information to the user community. I'll stop here. Thank you.
3 succinct points. Thank you, Arghya, for making 3 succinct points. And I realized that my microphone was muted when I was talking. And without any further time to take, I'd like to hand over it to Hermes to mention about the side event and another fun event that we are going to organize to freshen ourselves and making ourselves ready for tomorrow. So over to you, Hermes.
Thank you so much, Babu. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. We are immediately going into 2 more parallel events. We have a special side event entitled Partnerships to Harmonize Science Information and Knowledge at Regional Scales for Enabling Adaptation. And we also have an origami night. Both are starting right now, so I would highly encourage you to go back to the conference community website and you'll be able to find those links live ready for you right now. But otherwise, please, as always, feel free to explore the exhibitions or set up chats and meetings with other conference attendees and join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN2020. Thank you again for your participation. See you in the next sessions and have a wonderful day, everyone.